photograph that Jonathan found among the scattered bones was unlike anything he had ever seen. Even now, months after discovering it on that waterlogged camera, he couldn't look at the image for more than a few seconds without feeling his hands begin to shake. The picture showed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about what lived in the deepest corners of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. In the photograph, a massive creature stood just feet away from where the camera had captured its final image. The beast towered nearly 8 feet tall, its enormous frame covered in dark, matted hair that gleamed wetly in the camera's flash. But it wasn't the size that made Jonathan's blood run cold every time he looked at it. It was the intelligence burning in those eyes, a calculating awareness that stared directly into the camera lens with an understanding that was unmistakably sentient. The creature's proportions were wrong for any known animal. Its arms hung too long and muscular, ending in hands that were too large and too human-like for comfort. The skull was too prominent and intelligent-looking for a bear, yet too primitive and brutal for any human. The massive shoulders and chest suggested strength that could easily tear a person apart, while the stance and posture indicated a bipedal creature that moved through the forest with deadly purpose. What disturbed Jonathan most was the creature's expression. This wasn't a wild animal caught by surprise or reacting in fear to an unexpected flash. The beast appeared to be posing deliberately, as if it understood exactly what the camera was and what it would record. Its mouth was open in what might have been a snarl or a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that were too large and too sharp for any creature that should exist in these mountains. The photograph had been the final image on a camera that belonged to a hiker who had vanished 5 years earlier. Jonathan had found the device carefully hidden in a small cave, protected from the elements as if someone or something had deliberately preserved it. The camera's memory card contained dozens of other photos that told an increasingly terrifying story of a man being stalked through the wilderness by something that shouldn't exist. The discovery had transformed Jonathan from a casual weekend hunter into someone obsessed with uncovering the truth. The creature in the photograph was real, and the forests were inhabited by something that had remained hidden for generations. What started as a routine elk hunt in November 2024 had become the beginning of an investigation that would reveal truths about the Olympic Peninsula wilderness that were more terrifying than Jonathan could have imagined. It was a foggy morning in the Olympic National Forest. Jonathan was 3 days into elk season, November 15th, 2024, and he had gone deeper into the woods than he ever had before. He had been tracking the same elk herd for 2 days, following their tracks through thick brush and steep hills in this remote part of Washington state. Jonathan had hunted these mountains for over 20 years, but he had never been to this particular area. The terrain was rough. Thick cedar and hemlock trees blocked out most of the sunlight, and huge fallen logs forced him to constantly change direction. The forest floor was covered with slippery moss, hidden streams, and holes that could easily trip up a hiker. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Jonathan noticed something strange. He was following an animal trail along a steep hill when he saw a flash of bright color through the trees below. Orange fabric was sticking out from under years of dead leaves and forest debris. It stood out clearly against the brown and green of the woods. He thought another hunter had probably lost some gear, maybe a safety vest that had blown away in the wind. But as he carefully climbed down the slippery slope using his rifle to keep his balance, he started to realize what he was really looking at. The orange fabric was a safety vest, but it wasn't just lost equipment. Spread around a small clearing hidden under 5 years of fallen leaves were human bones. The bones were white from being exposed to weather for so long, scattered across an area about 30 feet wide. A skull with a cracked top and missing bottom jaw sat against a big cedar tree. Jonathan's heart started racing when he saw what was really there. The bones had been spread around by animals over the years. Rib bones and arm bones were scattered far from where the person had died. What made it worse were the deep scratches and bite marks on several of the bigger bones, clear signs that this person had died violently. Mixed in with the bones were pieces of hiking gear. A torn and faded backpack was crushed against a fallen log. The metal frame was bent in ways that didn't make sense, like something with huge hands had twisted it. Jonathan also found a beat-up water bottle with what looked like claw marks on it and pieces of a sleeping bag that had been ripped to shreds. What really shocked Jonathan was finding electronic devices. Inside a small cave made by some big rocks, he found a smartphone in a cracked case and a digital camera with a broken lens. Both devices had been carefully placed in this dry spot, like someone had deliberately tried to protect. Jonathan knew this was serious. He took dozens of photos of the scene from different angles to document where everything was before anything got moved. 20 years of hunting had taught him to preserve evidence, and he knew the police would want to see everything exactly as he found it. Using his satellite communicator, Jonathan called the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Within 2 hours, a helicopter landed in the nearest clearing about half a mile away, carrying investigators, forensic specialists, and search and rescue people. As the investigation team carefully documented and collected the bones, they started to see patterns that painted a disturbing picture of what had happened. The condition of the remains suggested the person had died during late fall or early winter, based on how some bones had been protected by snow. What was really troubling were the strange bite marks and scratches on multiple bones. The forensic examination showed trauma patterns unlike anything in normal animal attack cases. The bite marks were too big for any known predators in the area, but they showed a pattern that suggested intelligence in how the bones had been broken. Bears usually leave crushing marks and tooth holes. These marks were different, more deliberate, almost like they had been done on purpose. How the remains were scattered also raised questions. While animals often spread bones around after feeding, this pattern was unusually wide and didn't make natural sense. Some bones had been found high up in tree branches, way beyond where ground animals could reach. Others were arranged in what almost looked like deliberate patterns. A search of missing persons databases quickly revealed the likely identity of the deceased. The timing, location, and description of the gear all pointed to a 28-year-old software engineer from Seattle who had vanished during a solo backpacking trip in November 2019. The missing man had been an experienced hiker with dozens of successful wilderness expeditions under his belt, making his disappearance all the more mysterious. The original search had been extensive but ultimately unsuccessful. He had filed a detailed itinerary with park rangers, planning a 5-day solo trek through some of the most remote areas of the Olympic Peninsula. His route was ambitious, a challenging loop that would take him far from established trails into areas that few hikers ever visited. When he failed to return on his scheduled date, search teams had scoured the area for 2 weeks before being forced to call off the operation due to dangerous weather conditions. The recovery of the missing man's electronic devices offered the potential for answers that had been missing for 5 years. Both the smartphone and camera had been exposed to moisture and temperature extremes, but their protective cases had done their job reasonably well. The phone's screen was cracked and its battery long dead, but the internal memory appeared intact. The camera showed more promise. While its lens was damaged, the memory card was in surprisingly good condition. The task of extracting data from the damaged devices fell to digital forensics specialists. The phone revealed the hiker's final text messages and attempts to contact emergency services. His last successful communication had been on November 18, 2019, when he sent a text saying he was running behind schedule but was safe and planning to reach his next checkpoint the following day. After that, the phone showed dozens of failed attempts to send messages and place calls, all blocked by the lack of cell service in the remote wilderness. But it was the camera that yielded the most significant and disturbing evidence. The memory card contained over 200 photos documenting the missing man's journey, from cheerful selfies at the trailhead to increasingly desperate images as his situation deteriorated. The photos told a story that was both tragic and deeply unsettling. The early images showed the hiker in good spirits, capturing stunning vistas of snow-capped peaks and pristine wilderness. His selfies revealed a confident, experienced hiker comfortable in the challenging environment. Photos of his campsite showed a well-organized setup with proper gear and adequate supplies. Everything appeared normal for the first 3 days of his journey. The tone began to change on November 19th. Photos from this date showed the missing man had set up camp in the same clearing where Jonathan would later find his remains. The images revealed an increasingly anxious expression on his face, and several photos seemed to be taken hastily, as if he was documenting something that concerned him. One image showed large, unusual footprints in the mud near a stream. Prints that were clearly not human but didn't match any known animal in the region. The photographs became progressively more disturbing as they progressed. Images from November 20th showed the hiker barricading his tent with fallen logs and rocks, creating what appeared to be a defensive perimeter. His face in the selfies showed obvious stress and fear, with dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. Several photos captured what appeared to be deliberate arrangements of sticks and stones around his campsite, structures that looked almost like warnings or territorial markers. The most chilling images were taken over the following 3 days. The missing man had clearly begun to suspect he was being watched or followed. Multiple photos showed him pointing his camera toward the tree line, trying to capture whatever he believed was observing him. While most of these images showed only forest shadows and vegetation, careful digital enhancement revealed disturbing details. In one photo, taken on November 21st, a dark shape could be seen partially hidden behind a cluster of trees approximately 50 yards from his campsite. The shape was too large to be a bear standing upright, and its proportions were wrong for any known animal. Digital analysis revealed what appeared to be a bipedal figure watching the campsite from the forest edge. Even more unsettling was a series of photos taken during the night of November 21st. The hiker had apparently heard sounds outside his tent and had used his camera's flash to illuminate the surrounding area. The resulting images were grainy and distorted, but they clearly showed a massive humanoid figure moving through the campsite. The creature appeared to be examining the man's scattered gear, lifting items and manipulating them with obvious intelligence. The night photos revealed details that sent chills through everyone who examined them. The creature was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, with muscular arms that hung nearly to its knees. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, and its face, partially visible in one flash-illuminated image, showed a combination of human and ape-like features. Most disturbing were its eyes, which reflected the camera flash with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. One photograph, taken from inside the hiker's tent, showed the creature's massive hand pressed against the fabric wall just inches from where the man was sleeping. The imprint of fingers and palm were clearly visible, demonstrating the enormous size and strength of whatever was stalking the isolated hiker. The last photographs told the story of the hiker's final desperate days. Images from November 22nd showed him attempting to signal for help, using reflective emergency gear to try to catch the attention of any aircraft that might pass overhead. His supplies were clearly running low. Photos of his remaining food showed only a few energy bars and a partially empty water bottle. More importantly, the photos reveal that he had realized the true nature of his situation. Several images showed him examining enormous footprints that had appeared overnight around his campsite. These weren't the same prints he had photographed days earlier. These were fresh, clearly defined impressions in the soft earth that showed the creature had been walking in circles around his tent while he slept. The creature's behavior, as documented in the photographs, showed a level of intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Rather than simply attacking, it appeared to be toying with the hiker, gradually tightening its psychological grip on the isolated man. Photos showed his gear being systematically moved and rearranged each night, always in ways that would be immediately obvious when he woke up. His water bottle would be moved from one side of his campsite to another. His boots would be found neatly arranged in impossible locations. His backpack would be opened and its contents carefully laid out in neat rows. This psychological warfare appeared designed to break down the man's mental defenses. The creature seemed to understand that terror could be more effective than brute force. By demonstrating its ability to approach the campsite at will, to manipulate his possessions while he slept, and to watch him constantly from the forest shadows, it was methodically destroying his ability to think rationally and plan an escape. The final photographs were taken on November the 24th, and they showed the hiker in a state of complete psychological collapse. His eyes were wild with fear and exhaustion, his hands shaking so badly that many of the images were blurred. Several photos appeared to be accidental, as if his finger had triggered the camera while his hands trembled uncontrollably. The very last photograph was the one that would haunt Jonathan for months afterward. Taken at 11:47 p.m. on November 24th, 2019, the image was clear, well-focused, and absolutely terrifying. It showed the creature standing just outside the hiker's tent, no longer hiding in the shadows, but boldly illuminated by the camera's flash. The beast was even more massive than previous photos had suggested. Standing fully upright, it towered over the surrounding vegetation, its head nearly level with the lower branches of nearby trees. Its arms were disproportionately long, with hands that ended in what appeared to be sharp, claw-like fingernails. The creature's face was a disturbing hybrid of human and animal features. Intelligent eyes set in a skull that protruded forward like a gorilla's, but with a mouth that showed unmistakably human-like teeth arranged in a predatory snarl. Most chilling was the creature's posture and expression. It wasn't simply looking at the camera, it was posing for it. The beast appeared to understand exactly what the hiker was doing and seemed to be deliberately presenting itself for documentation. Its arms were spread wide in a gesture that could have been interpreted as welcoming or threatening, and its mouth was open in what might have been a roar or a grotesque smile. The metadata from the camera revealed that this final photograph had been taken just minutes before the device was placed in the protective cave where Jonathan would find it 5 years later. The implication was clear. The missing man had somehow managed to hide his camera and phone in those final moments, perhaps hoping that someone would eventually find them and understand what had happened to him. The forensic examination of the remains provided additional evidence that supported the photographic documentation. The analysis revealed trauma patterns that were unlike anything encountered in standard cases. The bones showed evidence of massive, blunt force trauma, but the patterns were inconsistent with known animal attacks or accidental falls. Several ribs had been broken in a way that suggested the victim had been grabbed and crushed by something with enormous hands. The fracture patterns indicated that the force had been applied deliberately and with precision, rather than the random damage typically seen in predator attacks. More disturbing were stress fractures in arm bones that suggested he had been lifted and manipulated while still alive. The condition of the skull provided the most troubling evidence. While partially damaged by 5 years of exposure to the elements, enough remained intact to reveal significant trauma. The forensic analysis showed that the missing man had suffered a devastating blow to the back of his head, delivered with enough force to cause immediate unconsciousness or death. The impact pattern was consistent with a single, powerful strike from something large and blunt, possibly a massive fist. Trace evidence recovered from the bones included hair samples that didn't match any known animal species in the region. The hair was coarse, dark brown to black, and showed microscopic characteristics that were neither fully human nor clearly animal. DNA analysis of the hair samples proved inconclusive, with results that contained genetic markers from multiple species but didn't match any existing databases. As news of Jonathan's discovery spread through law enforcement circles, it triggered reviews of other unsolved disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. The results were disturbing. Over the past 15 years, more than 30 experienced outdoor enthusiasts had vanished in the wilderness areas of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. While most disappearances in such challenging terrain could be explained by natural hazards, several cases showed unusual characteristics that paralleled the documented case. In 2017, an experienced mountaineer had vanished during a solo climb in the North Cascades. His campsite was found intact, but his camera revealed photos of large, unusual footprints and shadowy figures in the forest. The climber's final photographs showed evidence that someone or something had been systematically moving his gear during the night, behavior identical to what the missing hiker had documented. A family of 4 had disappeared during a camping trip in the Oregon Cascades in 2015. Their campsite was found completely destroyed, with their tent shredded and their supplies scattered over a wide area. Rangers initially blamed bears, but the damage patterns were unlike any bear attack on record. More significantly, their camera was found hidden in a hollow log nearly a quarter mile from their campsite, containing photographs of a massive bipedal creature stalking their family during their final night. The pattern suggested that whatever had killed the missing hiker was not an isolated creature, but possibly part of a larger population that had been preying on isolated outdoor enthusiasts for years. The fact that cameras and phones were consistently found hidden or protected suggested that these creatures understood the significance of the devices and wanted the evidence preserved, perhaps as trophies or warnings to others who might venture into their territory. The discovery had profoundly affected Jonathan, transforming him from a casual weekend hunter into an obsessed investigator. The veteran outdoorsman found himself unable to return to normal hunting routines, instead spending his free time researching similar disappearances and studying the growing body of evidence suggesting that something unknown was living in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Jonathan began setting up his own trail cameras in the area where he had found the remains. The results were immediately significant. The cameras captured numerous images of a large creature visiting the site on an almost nightly basis. The beast appeared to be maintaining some kind of territorial claim over the area, regularly patrolling the clearing and examining any new disturbances. The trail camera footage revealed behaviors that suggested high intelligence. The creature was careful to avoid looking directly at the cameras, as if it understood their purpose. It would approach from angles that kept its face in shadow, and it seemed to deliberately position itself to make identification difficult. When Jonathan moved the cameras to new locations, the creature quickly adapted, finding new approaches that maintained its anonymity. 2 years of continuous monitoring revealed patterns in the creature's behavior that suggested a complex social structure and sophisticated territorial management system. The beast operated within a territory that encompassed hundreds of square miles, maintaining cleared areas that served as gathering places and showing sophisticated understanding of seasonal patterns by migrating between different elevations as weather conditions changed. Most significantly, the creature appeared to have developed strategies for monitoring human activities throughout its territory. It maintained observation posts near popular hiking trails and camping areas, allowing it to predict and avoid most human encounters while maintaining detailed knowledge of human behavioral patterns. On Jonathan's final night monitoring the site, he made a discovery that fundamentally changed his understanding of what he was dealing with. While reviewing his trail camera footage, he noticed that one camera had been moved during the night. The device had been carefully repositioned to face a nearby tree, and when Jonathan examined the location, he found something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the bark of the tree, approximately 10 feet above ground level, was a message. The carving was crude but unmistakably deliberate, symbols and marks that appeared to form letters and words. The message was partially obscured by the natural texture of the bark, but enough was visible to make out what appeared to be "Stay away" carved in rough, angular letters. The height of the carving indicated that whatever had made it stood tall enough to reach that level without assistance. The depth and precision of the cuts suggested the use of tools or claws capable of penetrating thick bark. Most disturbing was the clear indication that the creature was not only intelligent but literate. It understood human language well enough to communicate a warning. The implications were staggering. The carving suggested that the Pacific Northwest was home to creatures that were not only intelligent, but had somehow acquired knowledge of human language and communication. The sophistication required to understand the concept of written warnings indicated a level of cognitive development that challenged fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness. Jonathan's investigation had revealed evidence of beings that had been successfully avoiding human detection for centuries. The creatures appeared to be highly evolved descendants of early hominid species that had survived in isolated wilderness areas. Their intelligence was equivalent to, or possibly superior to, modern humans, but their development had followed a different path that emphasized harmony with natural environments rather than technological advancement. The recent increase in disappearances and encounters appeared to be linked to expanding human recreation in wilderness areas and climate change effects that were forcing the creatures into more frequent contact with hikers and campers. As their traditional food sources became less reliable and their territory was increasingly penetrated by human activities, conflicts were becoming unavoidable. The evidence documented through the missing hiker's courage and Jonathan's persistence revealed that the wilderness was not a frontier to be conquered, but a homeland to be shared. The creatures represented both a remarkable discovery and a humbling reminder that human intelligence was not unique in the natural world. Their successful survival and cultural development while maintaining harmony with their environment offered lessons that human civilization desperately needed to learn. The photographs from the recovered camera remain the most compelling evidence of what existed beyond the edges of human knowledge. The final image, showing the massive creature posing deliberately for documentation, served as both a warning and an invitation. It was a message from an intelligence that had been watching humanity for centuries, finally choosing to reveal itself to those brave enough to venture into its domain. Jonathan's discovery proved that the wilderness was not empty, but inhabited by beings whose intelligence and capabilities rivaled our own. The question now was whether humanity was ready to acknowledge neighbors it had never known existed, or whether the ancient patterns of territorial conflict would continue to claim victims from both sides. The truth about what happened to the missing hiker and countless others would remain officially classified, but for those willing to look beyond carefully crafted explanations, the evidence was clear. We are not alone on this planet, and we have never been alone. In the deepest forests and most remote mountains, ancient intelligences continue to watch and wait, protecting their territory and their secrets with a patience that spans generations. The photograph that no one wanted to examine was proof that somewhere in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest wilderness, something powerful and intelligent was still deciding whether humanity was ready to share the world it had claimed as its own. I can't believe I'm finally writing this down. What happened to me in the Mount Hood National Forest last October challenges everything I thought I knew about what it means to be human. For months, I've told everyone, the rangers, the doctors, my family, that I survived 6 days alone in the wilderness after a hiking accident. That's not the whole truth. The reality is far stranger and far more unsettling than anything I could have imagined when I set out to prove my survival skills in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. I had always considered myself tougher than most people gave me credit for. At 34, I worked a desk job at an insurance company in Portland, but my weekends were spent watching survival shows and reading wilderness guides. I owned every piece of gear REI sold, from titanium cookware to a $400 sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures. My apartment walls were lined with books about primitive living, foraging, and bushcraft. Yet despite all my theoretical knowledge and expensive equipment, I had never spent more than 2 nights camping, and never alone. That was about to change. The idea had been gnawing at me for months. Every time a coworker mentioned their weekend hiking trip or a friend posted photos from a camping adventure, I felt a familiar sting of inadequacy. I talked a big game about survival skills, often correcting others about proper fire-building techniques or the best way to purify water. But deep down, I knew I was all theory and no practice. The realization that I might be nothing more than an armchair survivalist ate at me until I couldn't stand it anymore. On a rainy Thursday evening in late September, I spread a topographical map across my kitchen table and began planning what I would later call my proving ground expedition. I traced potential routes with my finger, searching for the most remote area I could find within driving distance of Portland. My eyes settled on a section of the Cascade Range, deep in the Mount Hood National Forest, a vast wilderness area where a person could walk for days without encountering another human being. The plan was simple: venture deep into the forest, far from any established trails or campsites, and survive for 5 days using only what I could carry and what nature provided. No tent, I would build my own shelter. No prepared food after the first day. I would forage and, if necessary, hunt with primitive tools I would craft myself. It would be the ultimate test of everything I had studied and theorized about for years. I spent the following weekend gathering supplies and meticulously planning my route. I loaded my backpack with the essentials: a quality knife, fire-starting materials, water purification tablets, a small amount of emergency food, basic medical supplies, and a few tools that would help me build shelter and craft other implements. I deliberately left behind my GPS, relying instead on a compass and paper maps. This wasn't going to be some comfortable car camping trip. This was going to be real survival. Before leaving, I called my sister Sarah to inform her of my plans. I kept the details vague, mentioning only that I was going on an extended camping trip in the Mount Hood area, and that she shouldn't worry unless she hadn't heard from me after 7 days. Sarah, who knew my tendency toward overconfidence, expressed concern, but I brushed off her worries with characteristic bravado. Early on Monday morning, October 2nd, I loaded my gear into my Honda CR-V and headed east toward the mountains. The drive took me through increasingly remote terrain as I left the suburban sprawl of Portland behind and climbed into the forested foothills of the Cascades. After 3 hours of driving on progressively smaller roads, I reached the trailhead I had selected, a barely marked access point that saw little use except during hunting season. I shouldered my pack and checked my compass one final time. According to my calculations, my destination lay approximately 12 miles northeast, in a drainage basin surrounded by steep ridges that would provide both shelter and isolation. The terrain would be challenging, but I was confident in my physical fitness and navigation skills. The first few hours of hiking passed uneventfully. I followed game trails and creek beds, stopping periodically to check my position and take photos with a small digital camera. The forest was magnificent. Towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks created a cathedral-like canopy overhead, while the understory was carpeted with moss and ferns. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the distant call of birds. As the day wore on, my confidence grew. My pack felt manageable, my pace was steady, and my navigation was spot on. This was exactly what I had imagined, just me against the wilderness, proving that I possessed the skills and mental toughness to thrive in nature's most challenging environment. By late afternoon, I reached my intended destination, a small clearing beside a clear running creek nestled between two forested ridges. The location was perfect: water source, level ground for shelter construction, and plenty of dead wood for building and fuel. Most importantly, it was exactly where I had planned to be, confirming my navigation skills and boosting my confidence even further. I spent the remaining daylight hours constructing my shelter. I had studied dozens of primitive shelter designs, and I chose to build what survival experts called a debris hut, a framework of branches covered with layers of leaves, bark, and moss to provide insulation and weather protection. The work was more physically demanding than I had anticipated, requiring me to gather armloads of materials and carefully weave them into a weatherproof structure. As darkness fell, I sat beside my newly completed shelter and admired my handiwork. The structure looked exactly like the ones I'd seen in survival manuals, a low, tunnel-shaped dwelling that would retain my body heat while protecting me from wind and rain. I felt a surge of pride as I kindled my first fire using primitive friction methods, producing a small flame from a bow drill I had crafted from dead cedar. I heated water for tea and ate a simple meal of trail rations while gazing up at the stars visible through the forest canopy. The silence was profound, deeper and more complete than anything I had experienced in the city. Occasionally, I heard the distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small creature moving through the underbrush, but otherwise the night was perfectly still. As I prepared for sleep, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and connection with the natural world. This was what I had been missing in my comfortable urban life, this sense of self-reliance and harmony with the environment. I crawled into my debris hut, surprised by how warm and cozy it felt, and drifted off to sleep with the confidence that I was exactly where I belonged. I woke before dawn on my second day, emerging from my shelter to find the forest shrouded in a light mist that gave everything an ethereal quality. I rekindled my fire and began my morning routine, checking my gear, planning the day's activities, and heating water for coffee made from wild plants I had read about but never actually tried. The day's agenda was ambitious. I planned to improve my shelter, scout the surrounding area for food sources, and practice various bushcraft skills I'd only read about. I spent the morning reinforcing my debris hut, adding additional layers of insulation, and creating a more efficient smoke hole for the small fire I planned to maintain inside during cold nights. Around midday, I decided to explore the creek system to search for edible plants and possibly fish. I followed the stream downstream for about a mile, cataloging various plants I recognized from my field guides and marking potential fishing spots where the water pooled deep enough to harbor trout. It was during this exploration that I first noticed something unusual. As I knelt beside the creek to examine what I thought might be watercress, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a dark shape moving quickly between the trees on the opposite bank. When I looked directly at the spot, however, there was nothing there. I told myself it was probably a deer or elk that had been startled by my presence. Large animals were common in this area, and it made sense that they would avoid human contact. Still, something about the movement had seemed different, more purposeful and less panicked than a fleeing animal. I continued my exploration, but found myself glancing frequently over my shoulder and listening more intently to the sounds of the forest. Several times over the next hour, I caught similar glimpses of movement, always in my peripheral vision, always too quick to identify clearly. Each time I investigated, I found nothing but empty forest. By late afternoon, I had convinced myself that my imagination was playing tricks on me. The isolation and unfamiliar environment were probably making me hyper-aware of every small sound and movement. I had read about this phenomenon in survival psychology books, how the human mind, evolved for social environments, could become paranoid when placed in complete solitude. I spent the evening hours practicing fire-making techniques and crafting simple tools from wood and stone. I felt pleased with my progress and my growing comfort in the wilderness environment. As darkness fell, however, my earlier unease began to return. The forest seemed different at night, not just darker, but somehow more watchful. I found myself starting at every small sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird. I tried to dismiss these feelings as normal adjustment to an unfamiliar environment, but sleep came fitfully. Throughout the night, I woke repeatedly, convinced I had heard something moving outside my shelter. Each time I lay motionless, listening intently to the darkness beyond my thin walls of sticks and leaves. Sometimes I heard what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any small animal. But whenever I worked up the courage to peer outside, I saw nothing but the dying embers of my fire and the dark shapes of trees silhouetted against the stars. My third day dawned gray and overcast, with a chill in the air that suggested the possibility of rain. I felt groggy and unrested, my nerves frayed from a night of broken sleep and mounting anxiety. The confident survivalist who had built his shelter 2 days earlier was beginning to doubt himself. Despite my fatigue, I forced myself to maintain my planned routine. I needed water, and the creek was my only reliable source. I had been boiling all my drinking water as a precaution against Giardia and other waterborne pathogens, but my supply was running low. The walk to the creek required crossing a steep, rocky slope where the stream cut through a small gorge. I had traversed this section several times without difficulty, but my exhaustion and distracted mental state made me careless. As I stepped onto what appeared to be a stable rock, my foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. The fall happened so quickly that I barely had time to register what was occurring. One moment I was stepping confidently toward the water. The next I was tumbling down the rocky slope, my body bouncing off stones and roots before coming to rest at the creek's edge with my right foot twisted at an unnatural angle. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white, hot spike of agony that shot up my leg and brought tears to my eyes. I tried to stand, but the moment I put weight on my injured foot, another wave of pain dropped me back to the ground. When I examined the injury, my heart sank. My ankle was already beginning to swell, and the foot sat at an angle that clearly indicated broken bones. For the first time since beginning my expedition, I felt real fear. A broken foot in the wilderness was potentially a death sentence. I couldn't walk, which meant I couldn't hunt, forage effectively, or escape from predators. Every survival manual I had ever read emphasized the same point. Mobility was essential for survival. An immobilized animal was a dead animal. I forced myself to think rationally despite the pain and rising panic. My camp was roughly a quarter-mile upstream, and I would have to crawl the entire distance. The thought was daunting, but I had no choice. Moving carefully to avoid jarring my injured foot, I began the slow, agonizing journey back to my shelter. The crawl took over an hour. Every few yards, I had to stop and rest, panting from the exertion and fighting waves of nausea brought on by the constant pain. By the time I reached my camp, my hands were bloody from grabbing rough bark and sharp stones, and my injured foot had swollen to twice its normal size. Once back at my shelter, my first priority was fashioning some kind of weapon. My knife was useful for many tasks, but it wouldn't be much help against a large predator. Working with materials within reach of my camp, I selected a straight branch about 5 feet long and began sharpening one end with my knife, creating a crude but potentially effective spear. The weapon provided some psychological comfort, but my situation remained desperate. I was essentially trapped, dependent on my small food reserves and whatever edible plants grew within crawling distance of my camp. Worse, the sound and commotion of my injury might have attracted the attention of predators who could sense vulnerability. As if summoned by my fears, I heard a rustling in the brush behind my shelter. I turned, gripping my makeshift spear, and felt my blood freeze. A young black bear had emerged from the forest and was standing about 30 feet away, sniffing the air with obvious curiosity. My mind raced through everything I had read about bear encounters. Black bears were generally less aggressive than grizzlies, and the recommended response was to make yourself appear large and fight back if attacked. But those tactics assumed you could stand, run, and use your full range of motion. Sitting on the ground with a broken foot, I felt utterly helpless. The bear approached slowly, its movements cautious but determined. I began shouting and waving my spear, hoping to intimidate the animal into leaving. For a moment, the bear paused, considering this noisy, injured creature that smelled like easy prey but was acting like a threat. Then, perhaps driven by hunger or simple curiosity, the bear rushed forward. I thrust my spear toward the animal, not trying to injure it but hoping to frighten it away. The bear, however, was not deterred. It knocked the spear aside with one powerful swipe and lunged for my already injured leg. The bear's teeth clamped down on my broken ankle, sending a new explosion of pain through my body. Worse, the animal's weight and strength drove me backward against the trunk of a large fir tree. My head struck the rough bark with a sickening crack, and stars exploded across my vision. As consciousness began to fade, I heard something that made no sense, a loud, unmistakably human roar echoing through the forest. The sound was deep and primal, more savage than any human voice should be capable of producing, yet undeniably emanating from a human throat. The bear immediately released my leg and turned toward the source of the roar, its ears flattened against its head in obvious fear. Through my fading vision, I saw a massive shape moving through the trees, tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with surprising speed despite its size. My last coherent thought before losing consciousness was a desperate hope. Perhaps a ranger had heard the commotion and come to investigate. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a place that defied immediate comprehension. Instead of the forest floor where I had fallen, I was lying on a bed of soft moss and pine boughs, inside what appeared to be a natural cave. The space was larger than my debris hut, but felt infinitely more secure, with stone walls that would provide protection from both weather and predators. A small fire burned near the cave entrance, casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. The smoke found its way out through cracks in the ceiling, indicating that this shelter had been used many times before. Most surprisingly, my injured foot had been carefully wrapped in what looked like a poultice of green leaves held in place by strips of bark. Movement near the fire caught my attention, and I turned to see my rescuer for the first time. The figure was unmistakably human in basic structure, bipedal with the general proportions of a man, but unlike any human I had ever encountered. The being was massive, easily 7 feet tall and proportionally built, with arms and shoulders that suggested tremendous physical strength. Most shocking was the creature's apparent wildness. His entire body was covered with coarse, dark hair that was not quite fur, but far beyond anything I had ever seen on a human being. His face, while recognizably human in its basic features, had a primitive, almost ancient quality. Heavy brow ridge, pronounced jaw, and eyes that held an intelligence tempered by something utterly feral. The being noticed my awakening and approached without speaking. I tensed, unsure whether this massive creature intended to help or harm me, but the being's movements were careful and deliberate rather than threatening. Kneeling beside me, the feral human grunted softly and pointed to several items arranged on a flat rock nearby. Strips of what appeared to be raw fish and a collection of berries and roots. When I hesitated, the being picked up a piece of the fish and bit into it, chewing slowly while maintaining eye contact. The message was clear: this is food, it is safe, you need to eat. My stomach was empty and my body was weak from pain and stress, but the thought of eating raw fish made me queasy. The feral human seemed to sense my reluctance. He grunted again more insistently and gestured from the food to my mouth. There was no threat in the gesture, but there was also no room for argument. I realized that refusing this offering might be seen as an insult or rejection of aid I desperately needed. Tentatively, I picked up a small piece of the fish and placed it in my mouth. The taste was surprisingly mild, clean and fresh, nothing like the fishy flavor I had expected. The feral human watched with apparent satisfaction as I chewed and swallowed, then gestured for me to continue eating. Over the following hours, I began to understand the routine of my strange sanctuary. The feral human came and went with remarkable frequency, sometimes disappearing for hours before returning with food, medicinal plants, or materials for maintaining the fire. He slept only briefly and lightly, always positioned near the cave entrance where he could watch for potential threats. Communication between us remained entirely nonverbal. The feral human responded to gestures and seemed to understand some basic concepts, but he never spoke a word. Instead, he communicated through grunts, hand signals, and body language that reminded me of a time before human language had evolved, a more primitive form of interaction based on immediate, practical needs. Despite the lack of verbal communication, I began to sense a profound intelligence in my rescuer. The feral human's knowledge of wilderness survival was extraordinary, surpassing anything I'd learned from books or videos. He seemed to understand which plants would reduce inflammation, how to predict weather changes by subtle environmental cues, and how to move through the forest with almost supernatural stealth. Days passed in this strange coexistence. My foot began to heal under the primitive but effective treatment, and my overall health improved as I adapted to the diet of raw fish, berries, roots, and occasionally small game that the feral human provided. I began to understand that I was witnessing something remarkable, a human being who had somehow retained or redeveloped the survival instincts and physical capabilities that civilization had bred out of modern people. The feral human's daily routine was unlike anything I had ever observed. He would wake before dawn, when the forest was still wrapped in darkness, and spend several minutes listening intently to sounds I couldn't even detect. His hearing was extraordinary. He could identify the approach of animals from distances that seemed impossible, distinguish between different bird calls that all sounded identical to me, and even detect changes in weather patterns by subtle shifts in wind direction that I couldn't perceive. His method of hunting was particularly fascinating to observe. Rather than using crude traps or primitive weapons, he seemed to understand animal behavior with an almost supernatural intuition. I watched him catch fish with his bare hands, moving with such patience and precision that the fish appeared to swim directly into his grasp. When hunting small game, he would spend hours tracking a single animal, reading signs in the forest that were completely invisible to me. A bent twig here, a faint scent there, patterns in the way leaves had been disturbed. One morning, I witnessed something that fundamentally changed my understanding of what humans were capable of. The feral being had been gone for several hours when I heard a commotion outside the cave. Through the entrance, I saw him approaching with what appeared to be a young deer slung across his shoulders. The animal was clearly alive but seemed completely calm, almost drugged. As I watched in amazement, the feral human gently placed the deer on the ground near the cave entrance. For the next several minutes, he performed what could only be described as a ritual. He placed his hands on the deer's head and made soft, rhythmic sounds, not quite humming, not quite chanting, but something that seemed to resonate with the animal. The deer's eyes remained open but showed no fear, only a strange kind of acceptance. Then, with movements so quick I barely saw them, the feral human ended the animal's life with what appeared to be a single, precise gesture. The entire process was conducted with a reverence and ceremony that was unlike anything I'd ever seen. This wasn't simply hunting for food, it was a sacred exchange between predator and prey, conducted according to rules and protocols that predated any human civilization I knew of. After the deer had died, the feral human remained motionless beside it for several minutes, as if paying respects or offering gratitude. The butchering and preparation of the meat was equally methodical and respectful. Every part of the animal was used: meat for food, hide for various practical purposes, bones for tools, even organs that I would never have considered edible. Nothing was wasted, and everything was handled with the same careful attention that characterized all of the feral human's activities. Over the following days, I began to notice other aspects of his behavior that suggested a complex inner life despite his apparent inability to communicate verbally. He would sometimes sit for long periods staring into the fire, his expression distant and contemplative. Other times, I caught him arranging small objects, stones, pieces of wood, interesting shaped bones, in patterns that seemed meaningful to him but were incomprehensible to me. Most intriguingly, he appeared to have some form of artistic expression. On the cave walls, barely visible in the dim light, I began to notice crude drawings that had obviously been made over many years. They depicted animals, hunting scenes, weather patterns, and human figures. Some of the drawings were clearly very old, while others appeared more recent. The style was primitive, but showed a keen eye for detail and a deep understanding of the subjects portrayed. The feral human's physical abilities were astounding. I watched him climb seemingly impossible rock faces with the agility of a mountain goat, track animals through terrain where I could detect no signs, and move through dense forest with barely a sound. His strength was equally impressive. I saw him easily lift and carry logs that would have required multiple people to move. But it was his endurance that truly amazed me. He seemed capable of sustained physical activity for hours without showing any signs of fatigue. One afternoon, I observed him engaged in what appeared to be a form of exercise or training. He would run up and down the steep slopes surrounding our cave, sometimes carrying heavy rocks or logs, other times moving with a fluid, dancing motion that reminded me of martial arts forms. His breathing remained controlled and steady throughout these sessions, and he never appeared winded or strained. His knowledge of plants and their properties was encyclopedic. The poultices he prepared for my injured foot contained combinations of herbs and leaves that seemed to change based on the stage of healing and the specific symptoms I was experiencing. When I developed a mild fever on my third day in the cave, he disappeared for several hours and returned with a bitter-tasting tea made from plants I couldn't identify. The fever broke within hours of drinking the concoction. Yet for all his primitive lifestyle and feral appearance, there was something unmistakably compassionate about the being's treatment of me. He regularly checked my injured foot, replacing the herbal poultice with fresh materials. He ensured I had adequate food and water. Most importantly, he never showed impatience or irritation with my helplessness and slow recovery. I began to suspect that my presence in his cave was not entirely unprecedented. Several times, I noticed objects that seemed out of place in his primitive environment. A piece of metal that might have come from camping equipment, a fragment of synthetic fabric, items that suggested he had encountered other humans before. When I tried to gesture questions about these objects, however, his responses were evasive. He would simply grunt and move the items out of sight as if their presence was a source of discomfort or unwanted memories. The more time I spent with the feral human, the more I began to question my own assumptions about civilization and human development. Here was a being who had maintained capabilities that modern humans had lost, not just physical abilities, but a way of being in the world that was more integrated, more aware, more authentically connected to the natural environment than anything I had ever experienced. I started to wonder about his origins. Had he been born in the wilderness and somehow survived without human contact? Was he someone who had chosen to abandon civilization and live as our ancestors had? Or was he something else entirely, a remnant of an earlier form of humanity that had somehow persisted in these remote mountains? The questions multiplied, but answers remained elusive. The feral human showed no interest in my attempts to communicate about his past or his origins. He seemed focused entirely on the present moment, on the immediate needs of survival and care. It was as if the past was irrelevant to him, or perhaps too painful to revisit. After what I estimated to be 4 or 5 days, my foot had healed enough that I could stand with the aid of a walking stick the feral human had crafted for me. I began to contemplate my return to civilization, but I was uncertain how my rescuer would react to my departure. When I made gestures indicating my intention to leave, the feral human's response was immediate and unmistakable. Those massive hands grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me close until we were face to face, only inches apart. The feral human's eyes, which had been consistently gentle and caring, now held an intensity that bordered on frightening. No words were spoken, but the message was crystal clear. I was not being held prisoner, but I was expected to show respect for what had been done for me. The feral human had saved my life, provided care and shelter, and asked for nothing in return except acknowledgement of that debt. I nodded slowly, indicating my understanding and gratitude. The feral human held my gaze for several more seconds, then released me and stepped back. The message had been delivered and received. The journey back to civilization took me 2 full days of slow, careful walking with frequent rests. My injured foot was still painful and weak, but the walking stick provided adequate support for the gradual descent out of the mountains. The feral human had provided me with several days' worth of food, dried fish and berries wrapped in large leaves, that sustained me during the difficult trek. As I made my way back toward the road where I'd left my car, I began to process what had happened to me. The experience challenged everything I thought I knew about human capabilities and the relationship between civilization and wildness. I had encountered a being who represented something that modern humans had lost, a direct, unmediated connection with the natural world that enabled survival in conditions that would kill most civilized people. On the afternoon of my second day of walking, I heard voices echoing through the forest ahead of me. As I rounded a bend in the creek I had been following, I saw a group of 3 people in ranger uniforms conducting what was obviously a search operation. When they spotted me, they rushed forward with expressions of relief and concern. The lead ranger, a middle-aged woman with gray hair and weathered features, introduced herself as Janet Morrison. She explained that my sister had contacted the Forest Service when I failed to return as scheduled, and search teams had been combing the area for 2 days. As the rangers examined my injuries and provided basic medical care, they peppered me with questions about what had happened. I told them about my hiking accident and bear encounter, describing how I had managed to scare the animal away with my makeshift spear. I explained that I had been forced to shelter in place for several days while my foot healed enough to allow me to walk out. The rangers accepted my story without question. It was consistent with the type of accident they encountered regularly, and my injuries and conditions supported my account. They helped me walk the remaining distance to their vehicles and transported me to a hospital in Portland for proper medical treatment. Throughout the rescue and medical evaluation, I never mentioned the feral human who had saved my life. I told myself that I was protecting my rescuer's privacy and way of life, but the truth was more complex. I wasn't sure anyone would believe my story, and I wasn't certain I wanted them to. Over the following weeks, as I recovered from my injuries and returned to my normal life, I found myself thinking constantly about my encounter in the forest. The experience had changed my perspective on wilderness survival, human potential, and my own place in the natural world. The transition back to civilization was more difficult than I had anticipated. Simple things that I had taken for granted, electric lights, running water, processed food, now felt artificial and somehow wrong. I would lie awake at night in my comfortable bed, missing the simple reality of sleeping on pine boughs beside a fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. The constant noise of the city, traffic, sirens, the hum of machinery felt overwhelming after the profound silence of the wilderness. My job at the insurance company became increasingly meaningless. Sitting in meetings about actuarial tables and risk assessments, I would find my mind wandering back to the cave, wondering what the feral human was doing at that moment. Was he hunting, gathering medicinal plants, sitting by his fire, arranging those mysterious patterns of stones and bones? My coworkers noticed the change in me, though they attributed it to the trauma of my accident. I had always been something of a know-it-all about outdoor activities, quick to offer advice about hiking gear or camping techniques. Now I found myself silent during such conversations, painfully aware of how little any of us really understood about genuine survival. The expensive survival gear that had once been my pride and joy sat unused in my apartment, and my collection of wilderness manuals seemed suddenly inadequate and theoretical. I had learned more about genuine survival in a few days with the feral human than in years of reading and studying. More importantly, I had learned something about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between theoretical understanding and lived experience. I began researching stories of feral humans, wild men, and other accounts of people who had lived outside of civilization. The internet was full of legends and folklore, but few credible accounts that matched what I had experienced. Most stories of wild men described violent, dangerous creatures, more monster than human. The being who had saved me was nothing like these tales. He was primitive, yes, but also intelligent, compassionate, and possessed of a dignity that many civilized humans lacked. I found myself drawn to anthropological texts about early human societies, trying to understand what life might have been like before agriculture, before cities, before the complex technological systems that defined modern existence. The feral human seemed to embody something from that earlier time, a way of being human that was more direct, more authentic, less burdened by the anxieties and complications that characterized contemporary life. The encounter had also taught me something about myself. My original plan to prove my survival skills had been motivated by ego and insecurity, a desire to demonstrate my toughness and competence to myself and others. The reality of being truly helpless in the wilderness had shown me how little my theoretical knowledge mattered when faced with actual danger. But the experience had given me something more valuable than mere survival skills. It had shown me what humans were capable of when stripped of all the buffers and conveniences of modern life. The feral human represented not just survival, but a way of living that was more integrated with the natural world than anything I had imagined possible. I began to make small changes in my own life, trying to recapture some of what I had experienced in the cave. I started spending more time outdoors, not with expensive gear and elaborate plans, but simply sitting quietly in natural settings, trying to develop the kind of awareness and attention that the feral human had demonstrated. I changed my diet, incorporating more wild foods and reducing my dependence on processed meals. I practiced moving through forests as quietly as possible, though I never achieved anything close to the feral human's silent grace. Most significantly, I began to question the assumptions about progress and civilization that I had never before examined. Was our complex technological society really an improvement over the simple, direct existence I had witnessed? Had we gained convenience and safety at the cost of something more fundamental, a connection to the natural world that had sustained humans for thousands of years? These were not comfortable questions, and they didn't have easy answers, but they seemed important in a way that my previous concerns about career advancement and material possessions did not. The feral human had given me more than medical care and food. He had given me a glimpse of what we had lost in our rush toward civilization. But most significantly, I had witnessed an alternative way of being human, one that maintained capabilities and connections that civilization had traded away in exchange for safety and comfort. The feral human represented something that I hadn't even known was possible, a way of living that was fully integrated with the natural world without sacrificing intelligence or compassion. I never returned to that remote area of the Cascade Range, and I never tried to contact or locate the feral human who had saved me. Some experiences, I realized, were meant to remain separate from ordinary life, not because they weren't real, but because they were too real to be absorbed into the comfortable routines of civilized existence. Instead, I carried the memory of those days in the cave as a reminder of what humans were capable of when stripped of all the buffers and conveniences of modern life. I had encountered not just a survival expert, but a glimpse of humanity's deeper possibilities, wild, powerful, and utterly authentic. The official record showed that I had suffered a hiking accident in the Mount Hood National Forest and had survived for 6 days alone in the wilderness before being rescued. The reality was both simpler and more profound. I had been saved by someone who represented humanity's forgotten relationship with the natural world, and I had chosen to honor that gift by protecting my rescuer's solitude and secrets. In the end, my expedition had accomplished its goal, just not in the way I had expected. I had indeed proven something about survival in the wilderness. I had learned that true survival wasn't about gear or techniques, but about recognizing when you needed help and accepting it with humility and gratitude. Most importantly, I had discovered that sometimes the most profound encounters with the wild leave no trace except in the changed perspective of those who experience them. For more interesting stories like this one, check this.